Hello and welcome from Bogota, Colombia to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those with some connection to Latin America. This episode is brought to you by LatamList.com. If you like this podcast, you'll enjoy LatamList's daily tech news reporting. Sign up for the mailing list to get weekly email updates. My guest today is Daniel Bilbao, co-founder of Truora, a service that does on-demand instant background checks all across Latin America. They're also a Magma Partners portfolio company. Originally from Cali, Colombia, Daniel grew up as a competitive swimmer and then went on to study in the U.S. After working in banking, he moved to Silicon Valley, where he was an early team member of BP, then co-founded a security company before deciding he wanted to make an impact in Latin America and co-founded Truora. We talk about his decision to focus on Latin America instead of Silicon Valley and why he believes it's important, how he thought about raising money for Truora, and his experience going through YCombinator and raising money from Accel and Kazsek after the program. We go into depth about fraud, identity, and the problems that Truora is trying to solve in Latin America. And also, we talk about lessons that Daniel's learned from starting and working for 3 companies in the Valley. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Daniel Bilbao. Hey Daniel, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Thank you, Nathan. No, happy to be here.
So where are we in the world today?
We are specifically in a WeWork office in Bogota, in Colombia.
And why are you in Bogota? What are you working on?
So I have a company that's called Truora. We're trying to solve fraud for all of Latin America, and we're starting with background checks. We provide fast and reliable background checks for companies in Latin America. So if you're trying to hire an individual or have an individual be part of your marketplace like a gig worker, we're able to run an assessment on them because we're trying to protect that marketplace both from criminal organizations and fraud.
So for someone who maybe is listening and doesn't know the reality of Latin America, why is this a big problem that needs to be solved, and how is it different from the US?
So I always say that it's painful for me to state it, but Latin America is a world of very creative people and where you can have very many professions, but there's a ton of unemployment. So one of the highest paying and highest risk profession is fraud or theft. And it is actually a profession. You got some of the best and baddest folks, and you can see this on Netflix and all over the world. We as a people are very good at criminal activities and fraud specifically. So when you're trying to protect and when you're trying to do business as a US or European company in Latin America, you always are quite surprised at the amount of stuff that happens. There's all sorts of fraud happening everywhere, and that makes it harder for business to be successful, and it makes it much harder for startups to be successful, and it's hard to invest. So being on your side as a VC, you're always thinking, man, how much this euphemism of leakages, like what percentage of whatever check you're putting into an endeavor is it going to take? So it is very much a profession. And there's experts here, artists, so to speak.
Yeah, and even just, I always tell people when they talk about, like, why is someone trying to steal your iPhone in Latin America more than in the US? Well, the incentives are your iPhone is 2 to 3 months salary for somebody.
Right.
In the US, it's like 3 days of work.
Exactly.
5 days of work. So why, the incentives are set up where you're going to have stuff like that more often.
And there's less opportunity, which is another point of why we started Truora. We believe that there's a ton of talent in Latin America. And when you're thinking about the world and what arbitrages are there to try to help bridge that inequality gap that's so large here, engineering is a very quick way to do that. If you're a super smart engineer and you get a couple of shots, like a couple of opportunities, you're going to be well. So when we were thinking about starting a company, we wanted to do something that helped the region. We are extremely patriotic. If I ever had a tattoo on myself, it would be my flag. And then the other thing that we wanted was to do something that was good, not just for the region, but it was good for our own people, like our own folks. So that's why we focused on having an engineering driven company that worked with a lot of folks from specifically my hometown in Cali, but also in Colombia. And then we'll do offices hopefully all over LATAM and help create that, bridge that gap of not ability, but knowledge. Because we think that people are just as smart here as they are anywhere in the world. They just don't see the opportunity. They don't see the ambition. And we're trying to get that to happen with our company.
Yeah, talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity just isn't.
And there's this expression in the US that saying when you're woke, it means like you understand something in a much more nuanced way than everyone else. I think that we're just on the cusp in Latin America of being awoken to understand that we're just as good as everyone else. We can compete with the best of them. And there's a huge market here that can allow us to build very significant companies that can have an effect, not just in Latin America, by the way, but starting with Latin America. And that's something that you just don't see in the region. Whenever I talk to founders, the thing that I'm most looking for is that ambition that's not like ego. It's more like, hey, yeah, we can build a company and have 300 employees and a couple hundred million in revenue. Like that's absolutely feasible. It's hard. You need a ton of luck, but it can be done. And we're just as good as everyone else to do it. Very few people think like that now. And I talk to everyone. I am telling you, very few. And that's something that can be learned. And that's something that can be learned from the founder level all the way to the entry-level employee. So that's also something that's very near and dear to our hearts.
Yeah, and we've seen that too with companies that we've invested in where, for us, obviously, the founder that's saying, I'm going to go do the 300-person company and 100 million in revenue, those are great. But the next best for us is the company that has all that talent, but hasn't had that
take that mindset shift, right? Yeah.
So we can help them turn that switch, and they say, "Oh, I actually can do this." Or, especially with maybe a third of our companies attack the U.S. market, and they say, "Well, no, I'm in Chile. I should expand to Peru." I say, "No, you're in Chile. You should go to the U.S."
Exactly.
It's actually maybe easier to even go to the U.S. than to Peru.
So for us, we have this view on Truora because the thing about background checks in Latin America specifically is that a background check is a proxy for fraud. What you're trying to protect against is a theft or some criminal activity. In the US, it's more compliance. You're supposedly trying to protect the marketplace, but the reason Uber does a background check in the US is very different for why they do it in Latin. Like there's going to be some similarities, but in general, they're not. And one thing that I learned with the last startup that I built was that the difference between California and Texas is significant. And it's not more so or less so than Colombia, Chile, and Peru. So the moment that you stop thinking about countries in South America, more like states, I've always said that we work in the United States of Latin America, and there's some bigger states and there's some smaller states, and it's harder or easier to have to do business in some versus the other. But if you have that mentality, then you can build something more significant, because then you get to see how alike markets are as opposed to different. I speak to a ton of founders and they say, oh, Mexico's super tough. If you're Colombian, then you're scared shitless of going to Mexico, and Brazil is a different world. You don't even want to touch that. Yeah. I'm of the view that you do everything, you do it right away. And if you can't do all those markets, then you either have a problem with the team that you're building or with the product itself that you don't understand it. That the spread too thin, I believe that happens from a product standpoint and from an initiative standpoint. I don't believe that happens from markets in Latin America. We're too damn similar to have that view. We'll see. I'm at seed stage. I'd rather say this and state it when we're at Series D and doing really well. But that's our view.
And there's been a decent amount of entrepreneurs that have been on the podcast that have a very similar view, that have been really successful, where they pick 2 or 3 countries and launch it simultaneously.
Right.
Because they think that, 1, you got to be able to do it in 3 markets, but 2, you're going to be more likely to be able to raise money if you're not just the company that's only in Colombia or only in Chile. Yeah. Getting it going right away.
No, I talked to a lot of founders. I'm sure like a few of the ones that I'm sure you've interviewed, we've sat down. I don't want to name them because I don't know if they'd be okay with it, but I would be like, launch Bolivia right now. Mm-hmm. Like, don't tell anyone. Just put 50K into it. Show it. Don't tell any investor. Just do it. Just get comfortable with learning. Because the thing is, you learn that market. You don't launch a market to get $1 million of revenue right away. You launch it to get an understanding of what's happening and to be able to build a foundation so that can go quickly. It's better if you can go all in and just hit the numbers quickly, but the learning takes time. So you want to do that in parallel, not in series.
So we'll talk more about Truora in a minute here, but I want to jump into you.
Sure.
So you said you're from Cali originally. How long did you live there for?
So I tend to speak in we because there's two of us. I have an identical twin. My brother, he's one of the Rappi folks. So I'm from Colombia. I was in Cali. I was born and bred there. I lived there until I was 18 years old. I was a competitive swimmer for my state and my country, and that's where this patriotism comes from, I'm sure. And then I worked. I started in Los Andes. I was an electronical engineer. I didn't want to be an engineer. I hated the lab. So I did a minor in psychology and in business. And I really liked business, the business side of it. But I was scared shitless of being out of work. So my dad went through 3 or 4 mergers while we were growing up. So they always sat us down at the table and would say, look, things might get tight. We'll see. We're going to have to make some adjustments. And it never happened. But that fear of I want to be employable is something that was important to us. So then what I did was I started working my last year of school. I lied at work and I said I wasn't studying, and I lied at school and said I wasn't at work. And I started working at this company called Mitsubishi Electric. And I was there for a couple of years, really focused on a career and being a manager, because in LATAM you think that to be successful, like you need to manage a big team. So I did that. And then I moved to Otis, where I did that as well. And I have a ton of knowledge in elevators, which no one cares about, but I know a lot. They're very safe, much more so than escalators, for example, fun fact. And then I went to business school at Tuck at Dartmouth. My brother also went there. We went together. It wasn't really planned that way. It was more because I didn't get in anywhere else. So that's where I went. And after that, I did investment banking in New York. With Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and I covered satellites, data centers, and in the US team that covered telecom and startups. And then I had the opportunity to either come back to the LATAM and run, I think it was a Cali office for Uber, or to work at this startup called BP, which was a marketplace that bought and sold used cars. So I went to BP, and this was in Palo Alto. So I did that for 2 years. And that's where I really cut my teeth in startups. I got to see a 20-person employee grow to 300 or something, $500 million in valuation, like launch a bunch of markets and then go under. Like we actually had to lay off first 100 folks and then another couple of hundred. And at that point, it was a big concern in my career. That's how I learned that failure is viewed very differently in the Bay. I was concerned about my job and my future for 15 minutes. And then I looked at my phone and I had 100 messages from actually 100 messages. Because it'd been a very public thing that was in the papers. And people asking me what I was going to do next, whether I wanted to work with them on something or join them at their current company. And then I was very happy at the prospect of, okay, so we tried something, it didn't work. You get a lot of learnings, and now I guess I can build something on my own. And then I started building this company called Paladin Cyber, so a cybersecurity and insurance company in the US. With a really good guy. His name's Han Wang. And we did that. We went through YC and we started building that. And it's going well, actually, that company. But for me, I always kept coming back at the fact that I'm very passionate about Latin America. I think that that corny thing that, what's this, Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. So for me, I feel like I've been so highly educated and I've had so much exposure to how the U.S. worked in New York, and then how it works in Silicon Valley. And then I got to see Rappi in the early days. I got to see BP in the early days, and a couple of other, a firm and a bunch of firms. And I've had enough mentors that it would be a disservice if I didn't take all that knowledge and build companies and do it in a way that's significant to our region. So that's why everyone gives me a hard time about why you always want to build stuff in Latin America. It's like the US is a better market, it's a bigger market and all that. I could, but in LATAM, there's a lot more opportunity. I'll have more impact, and it's more gratifying. So that's why we decided to build Truora.
And where do you think that attitude came from? Was it something from your family growing up in Cali? Was it something that came to you through education? Being
the responsibility, you mean?
Yeah, the responsibility. Why do you feel that way? There's a lot of people that would say, you know what, I'm just going to make a bunch of money in the US, and maybe I'll donate to charity.
So I'm not money driven, and that I'll clarify that. There's a certain amount of wealth that you need. And then once you cover that, money becomes not valuable to you. So after I've done investment banking and I had a significant salary, I could see my future. and I could care less. Like it did not feel like something that was important. And then second to that, I'm a very good poor person. What I mean by that is I can live on ramen no problem for a very long time and be very happy. My friends make fun of that. My banking friends make a ton of fun of that. And I was very lucky to have a very supportive wife who has a career as well. She's a head of talent in the West Coast in Silicon Valley, and she had a decent salary. And for me, what I figured, like I've always looked at impact from a utilitarian perspective. So I spend a lot of time helping founders, for example. I do that on Sundays, like they call it 1 to 4, instead of watching Netflix. And when they're asking about fundraising stuff or things that matter, if I spend a half hour with someone and I give them like good tips on how to figure out something, I introduce them to you and I introduce them to a few of my friendly funds, and they get funded and they can build a startup, I'm never going to be more impactful to that company ever. And it took me a half hour, an hour, or I could watch Netflix. Or I could, like, you know what I mean? So for me, it's a similar type of thing where if I have all this knowledge and experience, I should share it and I should do something with it. I think it comes from that. Maybe my grandma was very focused on, like, they're all teachers from my dad's side. They're all educators and they wanted to do that. So I'm a frustrated professor, I guess. I think that's where it comes from.
What was it like growing up in Cali?
Oh, it was super fun. My childhood and teenage years were great. I'm a twin, so you're instantly recognizable, which is not necessarily a good thing. You get like the bad thing of fame that everyone calls you out in the street, but you don't get the benefits on the other side. I was always with my brother, so we were hanging out. We fought all the time, very aggressively. It's funny how much we cooperate today compared to how competitive we were before. But no, it was great growing up in Cali. I loved it. And I knew that I needed to leave for more opportunity, but it was great.
And what's Cali like today? I think you're the third entrepreneur from Cali on the podcast. What's day-to-day like? What's the city like?
Well, there's no tech scene. Let's start there. It's good. It's a good life. The housing is cheap. There's not that much opportunity. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I think that the higher ups or the elite in Cali in general are not starting companies and not building the economy. So Medellin is doing really well, Bogotá is doing really well, even Bucaramanga is doing well, Barranquilla is doing well. Cali is stayed still, and that bothers me tremendously. It's a great city. There's very nice people. There's a lot of dancing. There's very jovial folks. There's very good schools. La Universidad del Valle, ICESI, Javeriana, Autónoma. There's many really good schools, but there's not good opportunity. So for us, building our headquarters in Cali was part giving back because 3 of our 4 co-founders are from Cali. It's also part arbitrage, but is executing on this idea that we had, like that you said, like talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. So if we build a really good company, hopefully we'll become an employer of choice in Cali. But more than that, we can drive outcomes significantly because folks that work with us wouldn't work at a high-performing startup. And they're just as good, by the way. So don't steal them, but they're really good.
That's what we've seen all across the region in Latin America, where you find people with extremely good talent, but maybe they didn't finish university because they didn't like it, or they ran out of money, or whatever it might be. And you see them 2 or 3 years later, and they're making more money than everyone else in the family combined.
Right.
And that's super interesting to see. It's really fun to be able to support that. But the biggest benefit for the company, beyond helping the people, is that they're going to be loyal. And the biggest problem in Latin America, in Silicon Valley today, is that people leave like engineering jobs at startups or even at Google and Facebook every 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
So the biggest advantage that I see of building tech in Latin America is that as a startup, your only advantage is speed and being able to have a good team, right? So if people are leaving startups in Silicon Valley every 12 months, you don't have that problem nearly as much, especially at early stage in Latin.
You know, you're starting to see it a little bit. I can make a really good business case for it, but that's not why we do it.
Yeah.
We do it because we think it's the right thing to do. Like whenever the best thing about building a startup is that you can build it to whatever you like. So for us, Some of the decisions that we've made is that we hire very junior. So we'll get very junior engineers, and then we'll hire a few seniors that can teach them. They'll grow into becoming very strong and very productive. And again, I could make a hell of a business case for it, but I guarantee you that it's much easier to hire senior. And that's one of the things that we do that goes against the grain, that we'll either be called very smart for a few years from now, or call it a big mistake. But we're so committed to it that we think that helps. And we see that. We see the change in outcomes just by growing the team and doing it in a thoughtful manner.
So jumping back into BB, you mentioned that.
Yeah, I worked there.
What was the biggest couple of lessons you learned watching a company go from very small to very big and then not working?
Man, we could be here for hours, but I'll share a few. One, middle management is super important. So some of the stuff that we did early is we would get this very good kids from very elite schools, and they would be at a job for 6 months, and they would be growing, and then they would need to become a manager, right? And then they would manage folks that are a year younger than them, and making sure that they had the right tools to build that out was something that we didn't do particularly well. We could get away with it because we were growing and there were things, but the importance of strong management skills for middle management, founders and management team obviously, but for middle managers is something that was super important. The other things that I've learned is how to communicate to a team where things are going well and when they're not. I have this idea of this well of trust. And the more you feed into it early when things are going well, the more resilient people are going to be afterwards. I also learned a ton about resilience. We had no one leave when the company was in a ton of trouble. And it's not because we didn't have issues, we did. But people step up when you see a big challenge that you're trying to overcome. And we did it a couple of times. It's just at the end of it, we weren't able to accomplish it. But most of all, I was able to see all the things that happen to a startup as you grow. For example, when you're 20, all hands are really not required. Everyone sees where you are. Then when you're 50, it's slightly different. Then if you move to a building that there's a divisive wall, then all of a sudden you have to do all these things to make sure that people are connected. Then when you start bringing in analytics and HR and career progression, all that's things that happen, I got to see. So it's not very specific, but we got to see very fast growth and how some choices early seem not meaningful, but then later become a huge problem if you don't address them. So that was good learnings.
And you've now seen another company up close go really, really high growth in Rappi.
Yeah.
How does both of those stories influence the way you think about growing your own business in Truora?
I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. I have a very different philosophy for growing businesses when compared to Rappi and Truora. I think Rappi is a hell of a business. I think Simon is a genius, and I would equate that all of us that are coming after him building companies, we owe him so much because he was able to get the bigger funds to come here when no one would, and the amount of risk that they would take, every single round betting the company and going growth and being ambitious in a way that wasn't disrespectful. There's so much to learn from the founding team in Rappi. And I got to see my brother work because he shared some of the stuff that they were doing a few months ago, and I got to see him work personally. And I used to criticize him so much for his style. We have very different management styles and philosophies and all that stuff. And after seeing him work for a couple of months, I have so much more respect for him as a professional. So I'll tell you what the things that I take from Rappi. You have to be focused on growth. You have to be focused on building a really good product. You have to bring in the best possible team that you can. This idea of launching multiple markets at once is something that I took away from Rappi. Because if you ask them, they wish they've done that earlier. What else? How to set up hiring so that it works. And then from BP, I learned product. Ale Resnick is really strong on the product side. How to hire the best quality on the junior team. Make sure that you're not, just because they're junior, just hire anyone, but hire for potential. I learned a lot about customer service and the voice of the customer, how you make sure that you want to have the best experience for them. And then there's a lot of the stuff that you just don't agree with that you'd rather not do. So you see someone doing it a certain way, and I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do it that way. So there's a bunch of that too.
Yeah, I had one of the best learning experiences, luckily at a very young age, where I consulted at a tech startup that was blowing up, that was failing. And I learned like every single thing not to do. And that was way more valuable than working at a really, really good tech startup that was going well, because it's easier to find the stuff that works, and learning in like, I think it was only about 3-4 months, seeing like, this is every mistake you don't want to make. So it's really good to be able to take from the good and the bad from people.
Right, but the difficulty there is you make a ton of mistakes all day. You just don't know which are going to be consequential, right? And you make a bunch of choices, positive choices all day, and then some really move the needle, and some are like, doesn't matter, right? So one of the things that we have in Truora right now is transparency. One thing that I learned was, as a senior executive, I always wanted full information. And I learned that the more you share with folks and the more you treat individuals as adults, they behave as such. If you treat people like children, they'll behave as children. If you treat them as peers and you consider them peers, and you really consider them, you don't just say that for like lip service, then it makes a difference. So that's another thing that we've instilled in our company that we hope continues for a long time.
So thinking about Truora, how did the team come together to actually start this when you had an idea to get it going?
So I was working on Paladin, but I was moving away from that. I knew that I wanted to do something else. I hadn't been able to convince the team to move to focus in LATAM, and I've decided like, this is what I want to do. And I connected with Cesar. He'd been working on this different startup called Expedientes that was really interesting. And it was one of those really smart engineers that I saw like, oh man, I could make something out of this. And then I met with him and David and Maite, and we sat down and we wrote it like on a piece of paper. I said, because I've been trying to convince Checker. Checker is a big background check company in the US. I could try to convince Daniel a couple of years ago to go to LATAM and build out like background checks, because I knew that Rappi needed and a few others. And they're like, no, we're focused on the US. He's very, very focused on the US. And I told them, if we do this, I bet you that I can bring significant revenue quickly. And then we started working on it, and then they just busted their butts and did it in like 3 months. And then we started working very quickly. With Rappi, we did a deal for something there with Uber as well, and we started working with Davivienda, and then it was off to the races.
So how does the product actually work?
So how does it work? You put in your ID, and it finds information, background check information. So criminal, there's some health stuff, legal records for the individual in less than 30 seconds. You can do it with an API, simple call, very quick, and you can get the detailed report. And it helps from anyone from the mother who's trying to hire a nanny and is trying to figure out whether this is someone that's trustworthy, all the way to the gig economy where they're trying to look at 10,000 couriers, 20,000 couriers a month, to fintechs who are trying to, when they're going to issue loans, they want to make sure that people are not in trouble. There's a ton of use cases. But the idea is you put your ID, you get the individual's ID, you get their consent, so you check the box, you hit OK, and then you get the background check.
And how does that process in a 30 seconds click compared to what somebody would do today?
Well, I mean, there's two types. There's people who do nothing and then just wing it. And there's some that pay for a very expensive background check. It's going to be, I don't know, like $30 to $70. It's pretty cumbersome. So the solutions, there's really a need for that in companies.
So let's talk about how you funded the business. You started out selling right away and then raised a bit of money.
Yeah, so we did it. That's one of the things I learned from before. And now I relearned because I have a different philosophy. So we priced it in a way that was fair, that wasn't cheap, but it wasn't expensive. And we funded the business ourselves. So Cesar, David, and I spent a bit of money, and then my team came in, and we spent a bit of money. And then once we had something like 5K, 6K of revenue, we had to make a choice. We decided we were not paying ourselves anything, none of the founders, and we were deciding how we were going to scale ourselves. And then Maite and I said, we can deal with this, we'll do the BD ourselves. And then Cesar and David said, we can hire a bunch of engineers in Cali. let's just get a house and hire a few of those. They're going to be less expensive, but that's not really the reason. It's because we wanted to be able to train them, and we believed that we could do that. And if we could grow the business, then we could start like paying incremental salaries and then start hiring seniors and things like that. But basically, we were trying to do as much traction as possible, as quickly as possible, to show that there was a real need here without having to raise money. And then we were very thoughtful about that. I'd gone through a very painful fundraising process before with Paladin, so I knew what folks wanted. Like, you would want some traction, you want some revenue, you want month-over-month growth, you want good logos, and then as soon as you notice that we work with marketplaces, then you'll go, well, is this helpful in other areas? So that's why we wanted to get a bank and a big staffing agency right away. Then we we got invited to interview at YC. We applied late, we got the interview, and then we were accepted. And this just from before, the strategy that we took was, we don't really need money, but we want to hire a little bit, and we want to set a valuation price. So then we decided that we were going to raise a little bit of money from a few funds, get a ton of help from the funds. Magma was one of the funds that helped us a ton. And then we raised very little, a couple $100K. And then we went through YC and did the whole process, which is basically, how do you get to a certain metric and hit that metric, and you can tell the best story that your company can, so you can raise money as quickly as possible and get off to build a business.
So one of the things that you do, you talked about your give back on Sundays, is help companies prep for their YC interview.
We do.
What's your top couple of tips for a company that's thinking about applying to YC, or then for the interview?
For the first one, for applying to YC, is just apply. There's a lot of people that negotiate themselves down and say, no, I shouldn't. Most YC startups have no traction. They barely have a team. And in Latin America, there's this view, because Rappi went in and it had a bunch of traction, and then Ogado and a couple of others had traction, that you need to be a well-built business to go to YC. That's not the case. So if you're a smart team, just apply. And you can always reapply. There's no issue. So that's the first recommendation. The second one is, be very thoughtful about that application process, and hopefully ask former founders or VCs or angels, people you know, to take a look at it. Because there's a very clear thing of what they're looking for as a whether you're fundable or not. But it's mostly very good team, decent TAM, and if you have some traction, that it makes sense. Or at least that's my view. And then try to talk to other folks who've gone through the process. Like, there's no shame in like learning from other people's experiences. So that would be my top recommendation.
And for the interview?
For the interview, so it's super quick. It's 10 to 15 minutes. I forget if it's 10 or 15, but it's rapid fire. There's an IPV website where you can just get the questions that they're going to ask you, and you're supposed to answer them in 15 seconds. Us Latin Americans tend to speak in in stories, like in Cien Años de Soledad. Like, this is the complete opposite. So what's your revenue? 40K. What's your revenue? Well, we started working at 40K, and then tell the story. Like, first the fact and then the story, and be very crisp on that. So that's my biggest recommendation. Like, no BS.
And once you get in, what's the best way to take advantage of it?
Depends on your business. Our business was in South America, so it was a little bit tricky. But so the best, how to get the most out of YC. Talk very closely with your partners. Focus on what's important. Try to avoid as many distractions as possible, because you're going to be there for 3 months and then everyone's gone. And try to do as your partners tell you. There's some things where you can skew away a little bit, but in general, they really understand what's happening. Like, this time around, every time YC would tell me, don't do this, I'm like, no, I'm going to do it anyway. I would regret it like 2 weeks later. So listen to your partners is important as well.
So you ended up raising money coming out of YC as a company doing business in Latin America. What's your best advice for founders thinking about raising money, whether they could go through YC or not, or raising money for business for LATAM from the people that you were able to raise from?
So we raised a little bit more than 3 million. We had 2 co-leads, which are Kazsek Ventures, a very good fund here in South America, and then Accel Partners, which is also a pretty good fund in the US. We're very lucky. So the first thing is, beggars can't be choosers. When you talk about fundraising, you first start like making these ideas in your head. What you want is money and hopefully someone that helps. But if they don't help and they just give you money, take it. Like, so my first suggestion is beggars can't be choosers. So start there. And then Our situation was somewhat different because we were very lucky. Through the experience in Paladin and through the experience that I've had before, I already had relationships and connections and new founders. So when you're trying to fundraise, some of the simple tips are make sure that you get introduced by the right individual. So the best intro that you can get to a fund is a founder that has made money to that fund. Second one is a founder in that portfolio. Third is a founder that portfolio wanted to get into and couldn't, but they have good relationships. Then if that doesn't work, then you start getting intros from your cheerleaders, like your backers. Like, for example, I would ask you for an intro if I can't get it from a founder. And then after that, you try to do cold, but you really want to avoid that. If you can go get through a warm intro, it makes more sense. Now, people have different views. Do you talk to the analyst or do you talk to the partner? And it is true that you need to convince two people if you talk to the analyst and the partner. But I believe people are people. You should always talk to everyone. If you can get an intro to the partner right away, it's best. But if you can't, talk to the analyst and actually help them out because their job is really tough. There's no tougher job than there are, but it's a very tough job to be a career VC. I think that's really hard.
So now that you've raised money, what's next for you and Truora?
So we're already in Colombia, and Mexico, and Peru, and Chile. We're launching Brazil soon. We're working really hard to build a particularly solid product on the background checks piece, but then we need to start looking at onboarding. So onboarding for fintechs is something that's very important to us. And to build a foundation to actually solve fraud, not just the background check, right? So one of the things that we're doing is we work with marketplaces and they share their data with us. So if there's a driver of one of the ride-sharing companies that has committed like a significant theft, then we know. And then they get blocked from the rest of the marketplace. And that's something that's very powerful because it's a sort of network effect that you don't get otherwise. And it would need to be someone like ourselves that has a ton of experience in marketplaces and that is trusted to be able to convey that information. So right now we need to launch more countries, build a really solid team. And if you're a solid engineer or a solid business person, please reach out because we need to talk to you and grow revenue, obviously, but also focus on building the really big next product. It's not going to be background checks, but the one that comes after.
Do you have any books, blogs, podcasts, documentaries that you like to recommend to people?
Yeah, so I was very lucky that my career started in sales, even though I was an engineer. I think that's one of the core skills that people are really bad at and they should get. So there's a book called Influence by Cialdini, and everything I ever do on sales, and I'm a decent guy on BD, and particularly strong on complex deals, everything I took from that book. Like, I kid you not. So just read that one. So that's good. There's another one called Grit. Grit, I can't remember who it's from. It's from a lady. It's a recent book, but it's basically a study on why some people, even though they have a ton of talent, are able to take tough experiences and then be resilient versus others. I think that to be a good founder and a startup person, you need to have a ton of grit, and being purposeful about that is interesting. And the other one, it's not a book or a podcast, but just talk to founders. Founding companies is hard, and learning from other people's experiences and being honest and candid about it is super helpful. And not, everything that we're killing it, everyone's killing it. No one's killing it. Some are not. And if you're killing it, be helpful. And if you're not killing it, be honest and just try to get feedback to see what you can do to improve.
So if you could go back to when you were just leaving for the US to go to university, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
So I would have started earlier. I was so focused on my career. I started founding companies at, I want to say 32 or 33. I wish I'd started at 22 or 25. I genuinely do. It doesn't matter if you don't do well. The amount of learnings that you get are so valuable. And if you're a decent engineer or a decent business person, you'll get so much out of that. It's better experience. It feels like the road less traveled. But I would have started earlier. So if you're thinking about starting a company, I think that there's no better time in Latin America to start a company than right now. There has never been a better time, so you might as well give it a shot.
That's great advice and a great place to wrap it up. Thanks for taking the time to do it. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Daniel Bilbao from Truora. As always, if you like the podcast, please share it with a friend so that more people can learn about what's going on in the Latin America tech ecosystem. I'd also love to get more ratings on iTunes. So if you really can take a little time out of your day to put a little rating there, I would really appreciate it. It really helps more people discover it. Be sure to check out latamlist.com for daily tech news updates in the region, and my book, Crossing Borders, if you want to know more about what's going on in Latam. Thanks to Angel, Sofia, and Josefina for helping produce this podcast, and thanks to you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.